Israel has been carrying out operations in northern Gaza.
And on the ground, reports that Israeli soldiers rounded people up. Life here is going backwards.
And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
The Middle East, once a center of science, trade and culture, the cradle of civilization, today unfortunately are regular in the news for only two reasons: oil and war. Two closely related topics. Countries like Israel, Iran, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia and others have spent the past century in constant conflict where it's hard to even tell who's on whose side. Iran backs Hamas, Russia backs Syria, America backs Israel. Yemen is in a civil war where it's basically the Saudis against Iranians. Iraq has fought both Iran and Kuwait. The Americans bombed Iraq, then even illegally occupied it. Qatar and the Emirates, you know what, it's impossible to keep track of everything. The most important thing for us now is to understand why all of this is happening today. How is it possible that the region is always in conflict? And of course, who started it all? It was the British. And the French. And the Americans and the Soviets didn't help either. But why? It was the oil. See you all very soon, good people. Peace out. Okay, it's not that simple. Here we have conflicts of interests, religions, and ethnicities. Good day, good people. Welcome back to History and Beyond, this time from Oman. Today, we'll dive deep into the history of the Balkans of Asia to discover the root causes of the conflict and to better understand the world around us. Make sure to subscribe as it really helps the channel. Let's go. Our first step towards discovering the core of these issues requires us to go back to the 19th century, specifically to the Ottoman Empire. By this time, it no longer held its former glory. Quite the opposite. With its new nickname, the Sick Man of the Bosphorus, it's clear that its peak had long passed. By the time World War I came knocking on its doors, the Ottomans lagged significantly behind the West, both in terms of technology and industry. Add to that the huge wave of national awakening across the ethnically diverse empire, which led to many separate revolutions, and you have an easy target falling apart piece by piece. By 1914, they lost almost all of the Balkans, the Caucasus, and all of its African territories. After the Ottomans cleverly decided to side with the Central Powers in World War I, which we know was a brilliant decision. The winners, specifically the British, the French, but also the Greeks, Italians, and Armenians, looked to carve up what was left of the former empire. London and Paris were particularly interested in the Middle East, but not because of oil, but because of its strategic position. It connected the rest of Asia with Europe, enabling these two powers to control key trade routes through the Persian Gulf and of course the Suez Canal. However, they already suspected that this region had a lot of potential for oil, as significant quantities of the black gold had previously been discovered in Iran. And as World War I showed just how dependent the entire world already was on this new resource, the Western powers' curiosity peaked. And this is where we actually get to the point. Or at least one of them. Back in 1915, with the strengthening of the Arab nationalist movement within the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French saw the Arabs as potential allies who could help them fight against the Turks. As always, enemy of my enemy is my frenemy. So, in 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, who governed British Egypt at the time, began secret negotiations with the leader of the holy Muslim city of Mecca, Sharif Hussein ibn Ali. What were those two gents talking about? Oh, nothing much. Just launching an Arab revolution across the peninsula. What would the Arabs get out of this? Well, McMahon promised Sharif Hussein independence for a vast Arab state, but only under the condition that he starts the revolution. Sounds like a good deal. Well, in theory, yes, but you know who you're dealing with. The British didn't precisely define what the term Arabia would mean. They promised independence, but purposefully stayed vague about the region of Palestine. For Sharif, this was actually acceptable because he believed that Palestine would now belong to the new Arab state. So he launched the revolt in 1916, which significantly weakened the Ottomans and strengthened his legitimacy as the leader of Arabs of the peninsula. However, again, you know who you're dealing with. The British and the French were at the same time secretly negotiating on how allowed to divide the Turkish territories, specifically the lands that the Arabs already lived on, the same lands that the British had already promised to those Arabs. So the two European diplomats finally meet, standing there, looking at the map, pencils in their hands. One of them trips, and while falling, accidentally draws a random line across the map. He stands up, looks at the map, looks at his colleague, and as they gazed into each other's eyes, they say, "Yeah, this could work. This goes to us, this goes to you." It doesn't matter what religion or ethnicity the people are there. Just let them fight it amongst themselves, and then we'll just waltz in and take over. So, Syria and Lebanon go to the French, along with southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. The British get the rest of Iraq, Kuwait, the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, Jordan, and the region of Palestine. However, the area around Jerusalem would be under international control due to its religious significance for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. At that time, the term Palestine was a geographical term that encompassed what are now the states of Israel and Palestine. Interestingly enough, the Russians also participated in the talks to carve up the Ottoman Empire. They were supposed to get Constantinople and a significant part of northeastern Turkey. But since they withdrew from the war due to their own chaos back home, that would never happen. In any case, this agreement not only mixed Sunni and Shia Muslims, but also mixed Arabs with Kurds and other non-Arab and non-Muslim groups. But I mean, they still had to beat the Ottomans. But during those years, the war wasn't exactly going as the Brits were hoping. With millions dying, the Western Front had barely changed from the beginning of the war, while on the Eastern Front, due to internal instability, Russia suffered heavy losses to the Germans. In the Balkans, the front lines weren't changing either, so Turkey was somehow still barely hanging on. London needed the support of a new power, America. But even though America declared war in 1917, they weren't exactly committed to the idea. Someone who was deeply committed to the idea of gaining territory in the Middle East was the Jewish community. A very wealthy and influential man, Lord Walter Rothschild, yeah, those Rothschilds, managed to convince the British government to sign the Balford Declaration in 1917. This would establish a new home for Jews in Palestine, the same territory the Brits already promised to the Arabs in 1915. The Jewish nationalists, aka the Zionists, saw this as the beginning of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. However, they would still have to hold on to that thought for now. With this move, London believed it would inspire Washington to get more involved in the war. Given that the Jewish leaders had significant political influence in the US, the Zionist movement played a crucial role in the decision-making of the two Western powers. Plus, of course, the British saw a strategic advantage in having a very grateful friend in Palestine near the Suez Canal, which they controlled. Moreover, London was also competing with Paris for dominance over Palestine, so this move was seen as a way to cement their influence in the region. When the Balfour Declaration became public, well, reactions were mixed to say the least. The Zionists were very thrilled about getting a territory, though non-Zionist Jews were concerned about how it would reflect on them globally. More important was the reaction of Arabs, who had been promised this exact same territory in the vague 1915 agreement and who also made up an overwhelming majority of the population in Palestine at the time. Although Muslims, Jews, and Christians had lived together peacefully until then, this deliberate British move, also known as divide and conquer, would spark the Arab-Jewish conflict, which to this day shows no end in sight. After the Allied victory in the Great War, tensions in the region grew substantially. The Arabs were deeply dissatisfied under the British and French control in the north, and although they gained independence in the south, conflicts with the Jewish population in Palestine became more frequent, leading to a major uprising that Britain brutally suppressed in the 1930s. Now the Arabs had yet another reason for distrusting the Western powers, which brings us to the second core issue, the creation of Israel in 1948. Even before the Holocaust, Jews were steadily leaving Europe for both America and Palestine. The Jewish population in Palestine rose from 11% after World War I to almost 1/3 at the end of World War II, while the percentage of Muslims dropped from around 80 to 60%. Tensions were so high that the UN proposed a partition of Palestine in 1947. One part of Palestine would be Arab, the other would be Jewish. The Arabs, of course, rejected this idea, prompting the Jews to declare the State of Israel in 1948. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen were not fans of this idea. So they actually attacked Israel only to lose to a much smaller opponent. As a result, Israel not only established its state, but also captured more territories than what the UN had proposed. This war caused the first of many Palestinian refugee crises, and in the Arab world, this event would be remembered as the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. From then until today, the conflict simply never stopped. Even early on, the US and thus much of the Western world took Israel's side, so they always had their protection and state-of-the-art weapons. This is something that many Arabs have not forgiven the West even to this day. I say many because during the Cold War, alliances and roles shifted significantly. For example, the CIA, in cooperation with the British, overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister to reinstate the Shah, the Iranian monarch Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But why? Because a democratically elected leader wanted to nationalize the oil industry, ensuring that the profits would benefit the Iranian people instead of the money going to London. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the British, so they installed Pahlavi, who was merely a puppet for the Americans and the British. All he cared about was power, so he willingly left the oil industry in the hands of Washington/London. Yet another reason why many Iranians resent these two countries today. At the same time, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser aimed to unite the Arab world and free it from foreign influence. Despite several attempts to create a united Arab state, this vision never truly materialized. Moreover, after the Arab states lost yet another war against Israel, which was now heavily backed by the US, Arab nationalism began to take a new shape. And this brings us to the third key point: Islamist movements. Instead of a secular state where religion is separate from public institutions, Islamist movements sought to create a state based on Islam. In other words, they wanted Islam not only as a religion, but also as a political system, a framework for societal and economic organization. This would fundamentally change not only the region, but the entire world. And so, in 1979, the discontented Iranian people overthrew the US puppet Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and in his place came Ayatollah Khomeini, establishing an Islamist theocracy, so not even close to democracy. His rise, however, inspired other Islamist movements across the region. Because of this, the remaining monarchs in the Middle East feared that they might share a similar fate. So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the Emirates began to move closer and closer to the US. But to be fair, they've already been on good terms with Washington for a while, giving them good deals for oil and countering the Soviets, while at the same time, their regimes were getting protection from Washington. This relationship was further strengthened after the Iraq-Iran war and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. After yet another war with Israel, Egypt also kinda moved away from the Soviets. Syria, however, remained a strong ally of Moscow, while Iraq's situation, well, initially, Iraq was a Soviet ally, but at one point, it even received American support in its war against Islamist Iran. However, the Americans quickly changed their minds because they didn't want Iraq to get too strong. Libya also allied with Moscow under Muammar Gaddafi's rule, as did the Palestinian faction led by Yasser Arafat. Too much info, let's move on. During the 1980s and the 90s, we also see the rise of the Mujahideen, a group of hardcore Islamists portraying themselves as protectors of the Islamic world against Western imperialism. Ironically, that very Western imperialism funded and supplied the Mujahideen with sophisticated weapons when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. This was Moscow's desperate attempt to maintain a communist regime there, and it was a brutal war that utterly destroyed Afghanistan and determined its harsh future. Thanks to American funding, many of those extremists who fought against Moscow would later go on to form well-known extremist groups such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Their hatred towards the West would only grow stronger after the Gulf War in 1991 and the illegal US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Which brings us to today. In Syria, a brutal civil war has raged on since 2011, involving the US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and other powers, which all have different interests in the country. Then there's the regional conflict between the Saudis, a Sunni Islamic power, and the Iranians, a Shia Islamic power, which is now one of the main reasons for instability in the region. These countries are fighting for dominance in the Middle East, but not on their own soil, of course. They use nations such as Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq, because why would you destroy your own country when you can destroy others? This is known as a proxy war, an indirect conflict where two powers engage through their associates in other countries. You've probably heard of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and of course Hamas in Palestine. These are Iran's proxies. But besides those, they also have other Shia armed groups in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. On the other side, the Saudis also have their armed groups in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. The recent conflict that erupted after Hamas's attack on Israel did not come out of nowhere. But it is interesting, however, that the attack occurred at the same time that many Arab countries had finally started normalizing relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. Hamas feared that the Arab nations might forget about Palestine because of the potential economic benefits that new trade deals, such as those between Saudi Arabia and Israel, could bring to them. Maybe everybody would just suddenly turn a blind eye to what was happening in Palestine. With that in mind, Iran is also likely afraid that as an enemy of the US, it could lose all influence in the region. So it's no surprise then that the conflict has also spread to Lebanon and Syria, places where Iran has its proxy groups. This is something that Israel used as a reason for yet another invasion. So they invaded not only Palestine, but also Lebanon. Of course, this is a very oversimplified explanation. So just saying that everything revolves around oil is not enough. It's a good argument, however, it's not the whole story. There have been multiple trigger events that made the Middle East what it is today. Broken promises and the desire for freedom, independence, and power. The ruthless games of big nations left these countries in a tough position in which they have to navigate as best as they can. Some found allies and prosperity, while others found enemies and war. So this was just a basic introduction into the web of allies and adversaries in the world's most geopolitically active region. To quote my own self, the Balkans of Asia. We've barely even scratched the surface, and each one of these topics deserves an own video. So definitely subscribe because you don't want to miss that. And now we're off to a new destination with new stories. See you all very soon, good people. Pozdrav!